Hello, hello, everybody joining, dialing in from wherever you are in the world right now. We've got a lot of people signed up to join the call today. So we will give it a few moments before we do our introductions and say hello to everybody and get started. You may notice we don't have Emma on the call today, and Lee isn't here at the moment. He's just looking for a room, but he is going to be back any second. So Emma and Lee are at the Employee Experience Awards today, which is very exciting. So Lee is here, but he will not be talking because he's in various lobbies and I think it's like a conference center or a hotel. So, but he is a silent listener, and I'm sure he will be adding his questions to the chat as we go through the webinar today. Just while we wait for the last few people to join, like I say, we had a lot of people sign up for this one, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time to let people in if they're trying to jump in from one meeting to another. So just while we do that, we'll do the usual kickoff that we normally do and invite you all to start by putting where you're dialing in from today into the chat. Let's see how far afield everyone's coming from today. Let's see. Lots of people still joining. Okay. Oh, we have all over the place. Colorado, Orange County, Liverpool, London, California, Berkshire, Bristol.
I gave myself a second.
And Hema, you had a question you wanted people to put in the chat as well as a way to build a bit of a community. What was your idea?
Yes, absolutely. Feel free to put your LinkedIn profile into the chat as well. We're all about community. And so just helping create that community and hopefully connect with one another here today, but also outside of this webinar too.
I love that. And obviously for our EX Space members, we've got our lovely EX Space community members joining us today as well. Great to see some familiar faces on the call. Hi, Dawn. Hi, Jane. Hi, Sarah. Fantastic. Okay. Well, I think we'll get started. We'll let people catch up as they join. We've got two fantastic guests with us today. Well, three fantastic guests. We've got Catherine as well, who works with Jamie and Hema. But Jamie and Hema are here to talk about designing exceptional organizational cultures. So a little bit of background from Hema and Jamie's bio. So Jamie Jacobs, Hema Crockett are award-winning authors, business leaders, and former HR executives. They have led high-performing teams and organizations within various industries, both within the US as well as internationally. In 2019, after nearly 40 years combined of HR and business experience, Hema and Jamie joined forces, founded Gig Talent, a modern talent agency that helps organizations level up their culture, their leadership, and their talent by connecting vetted high-caliber HR consultants and leadership coaches with forward-thinking organizations seeking a competitive advantage. So before we get into the big topic today, all around culture, let me just ask you to tell us a little bit more about yourselves, introduce yourselves, and also how you started working together.
It's a really fun story. So thanks so much for having us, Katie. And hi, everyone. We're super excited to be here. Hema and I first met, we came into our last organization together where we really built the function from scratch. And it was such an experience really focused on culture. We scaled from about 150 employees to about 700 in just over 12 months while building out every single function. So really thinking about everything employee experience and really wanting to build on the DNA that made that organization really special. And that gave us this lens of learning what worked and, quite frankly, what didn't. And it also gave us, just the great experience of learning that we work really well together. And so as we moved on and took the leap to do new things, we ended up coming back together, which is a longer story, but super excited to be here.
Yeah, I think that covers it.
It's very, very, very modest. I've read all about you in the front of your book, and you've both got very interesting stories and slightly different introductions into this particular area as well. Hema, was it you that was at base camp when you kind of had the realization that this is something that you wanted to do?
Yeah, it's funny. So it was probably 2 years after base camp. Right. I don't think in the moment I actually understood what I wanted to do. I just knew there was something more to life than doing the same thing every single day. And a few years later, that's when it really hit me on how I wanted to show up. And I think the type of
Sorry, Hema, got unmuted for a second. Let's sorry, I think that might be my fault. Let's try that again. Sorry.
Okay. No, of course, of course. So yeah, it was really just a few years after base camp that I realized how I wanted to work, the types of organizations I wanted to work for, and really what skill set I wanted to bring to the broader community, to focus on culture, to focus on leadership. And what's really exciting is Jamie, Catherine, and I get to do this work every day now, right? We get to look at more than just one organization. And I know we'll dive into this a little bit more, but some of the interesting things that we've seen are across industries, across continents. A lot of the things that we run into are pretty similar. Sure, some of your circumstances may differ slightly, but ultimately what we're talking about remains the same at its core. And that's why I'm really excited about today's conversation too, and really talking to people from around the world and hearing what their experiences have been like, and where we can help on this webinar as well in terms of what folks are dealing with.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you. So we often, when we're talking about employee experience and employee engagement, which is obviously at the heart of what we do at the EX space and also the sister company People Lab, we often say that culture is the soup in which a great experience swims. So really interested to delve into the connections between the two and how they can really support each other in having great experiences, having a great culture, and ultimately great engagement where everybody benefits. So I know that you've got some slides prepared. Yes. So I will hand over to you. If I can just invite anybody to pop their questions in the chat as we go through, we'll make sure that we leave time at the end for a Q&A. So I will stop talking and I will hand over to you.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you, Katie and team, for inviting us on today. And thanks everybody for joining us. I love seeing a lot of familiar names and faces pop up, and excited to meet some new ones. Our LinkedIn information will be at the end of our presentation with a QR code. So if you didn't catch ours in the chat, feel free to connect with us afterwards. As Katie mentioned, we're going to keep this relatively short from a slides perspective, because really what we want to get to is a discussion. We really want to have an open conversation, Q&A, spend time talking about what's top of mind for each of you in your organizations and what you're going through today, from whether it's culture, leadership, employee experience, all of these things. And what we'd also like to offer is a free 30-minute conversation with us after this webinar too. Where we can talk further about any of your 2024 cultural priorities, tension points in your organization, maybe aligning leadership, things like that. And so feel free to email Catherine, who is a member of our team and one of our amazing client service managers who will keep us on track today as well. We'll have her email in the chat, and we'll also have it at the end of this presentation. So don't think this is a one and done. We're definitely here to help and want to make sure that we answer all of your questions. And with that, we'll just get right into it. So I found this slide pretty fascinating and wanted to share it, especially since we have a bit of an international audience on the call. And this is from a state of the workplace culture that SHRM did globally, a global research study where they gathered data at the end of 2022 and early 2023. So there's a bit of a lag here as well. But take a look at your country specifically and kind of the employee ratings of their organizational culture by country. Does anything surprise you here? And if there's anything that stands out for you, feel free to put it in the chat as well. And in addition to that, how do you think your organizational culture stacks up to what the average is across, your specific country? Would you say yours is lower, yours is higher? Would love to hear kind of what you're seeing. I'm just going to scroll down into the chat. So don't be shy. Feel free to put anything in there as well. I'll tell you on my side, what stuck out for me as we look at the US. So Catherine, Jamie, and I are located in Southern California. And as we look at the US, 69% good or excellent. I mean, we've seen it much worse than this, don't get me wrong, but it's actually a pretty decent number as we talk about some of the things that we're seeing as companies are now reiterating on their return to work strategies as they're figuring out what their new employee experience is, what their new employee value proposition is. We'd love to see this number higher, obviously. Where we tend to spend a lot of our time is in that orange and kind of purplish red, right? The slightly poor or terrible. Those are really the workplaces that need a lot of assistance. They're the ones who maybe they're having a leadership issue or there's something that is creating a toxic culture. And that's really where we come in. And this book is that Jamie and I wrote is really designed to help across this entire spectrum. And it's creating a blueprint of how do we get to an exceptional culture. I'm just looking at Katie's comment here. If you look at the good, excellent, and slightly good, I feel like it's good when you compare it to some of the global EEIs and XStats. That's interesting. So you're kind of seeing something similar popping up as well throughout.
Yeah, definitely. I think we recently released our benchmark report. You can catch the webinar on our YouTube channel, and it made for quite depressing reading, actually, that things were so stagnant, things hadn't really moved on, and things weren't great, whereas this looks a bit more positive.
Yeah, and then I see a comment here from Toby saying it's interesting when you consider some of the other research that's come out where actually this was showing the US is well below 10% below India. And again, we're talking about, I believe it may say at the bottom here, but I believe it was about 11,000 employees throughout organizations that were actually surveyed for this research. And so sometimes you wonder, right, what is the data set that we're starting with? Who were these types of companies? But this is just to kind of set the stage for us as we go into today. So some of the key elements that we'll be talking about are really this idea of defining what is culture and really having this strong foundation of what is our starting point? Because a lot of times what we find is that people have different definitions of culture. And then in your organizations, you're trying to change culture, you're trying to transform culture, but culture is not really clearly defined. And so our starting points can be really different. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time today on each of these elements. So as you think about culture in your organization, think about your role as leader. What are those organizational core values that serve as that strong foundation or glue for your organization? And then talking about the types of skills that are needed as we move into the future and as we continue to see, quite frankly, skills changing as jobs of the future change, as new technology is introduced and AI is brought into the conversation. And then total rewards, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, engagement and motivation, and then so what? Right? What do we do with all of this? How do we get to the point where we're actually moving to action? And what we're also going to share with you in the chat is a PDF to a self-assessment. And this self-assessment is really just a quick culture self-assessment. And as we go along in each of these separate sections, feel free to follow along on that assessment to answer some of the questions. And so, Catherine, would you be able to put that PDF in the chat for everybody?
Yeah, I'll get that going.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So why don't we jump right in? So this high level of what is culture? For us, we really define culture as this intersection of values, behaviors, and actions. It's kind of how everything comes together at the end of the day. And so if you think about culture just at a very high level, just think about, how similar is your culture today to what it was like pre-COVID? My guess is that it's pretty different. And not just because we're having the conversation of remote work or hybrid work or anything like that, but really our preferences as employees have changed. And so what we're demanding of our organizations is starting to look different. And as HR leaders, what we're able to provide our organizations can start to look different as well. And I think as time goes on, we're going to continue seeing this shift that's occurring based on both internal and external factors. And I'll give you an example. Here in the US, it's an election year for us. And that actually greatly affects culture. It affects employees who want to switch jobs or who may be nervous to switch jobs. It affects what employees can offer in terms of benefits, as there may be changes on the horizon, whether it's taxability or whether it's new laws that are getting passed or laws that are being taken back. And it's also important to think about what hasn't changed in our culture. What are those elements that we really consider our secret sauce moving forward? And we view culture through 3 different lenses. We view it as yourself as a leader, which we've spent a lot of time on this one lately. This is coming up with a lot of clients that we're talking to, a lot of organizations. Right now, this seems to be top of mind. Your team as example. And as we know, it really starts with you as a leader first and the role that you're setting with your team. And then your organization as a whole. And it really takes all 3 of these to create that type of culture that employees want to be part of, that they want to contribute to. And so let me ask this as we look at this first one around yourself as leader, and feel free to think about this, put it in the chat if you have any thoughts about this, but how has your leadership team shifted the culture to normalize, right? Kind of the changes, the evolution that we're seeing in organizations and in the way people work, and enroll your team to be part of really creating new ways of thinking, new ways of working, new ways of being together. What role have they played? And what are their actions really speaking? And what are they saying? As we think about this, for us, what's really important is that culture is a continuous feedback loop. How often are you talking about culture in your organizations, right? Many times, if you think about a leadership team meeting, we talk about our financials. We talk about the strategy of the organization and where we're going. But in order to get there, we need people. We need to build an organization where people want to work, yet we rarely talk about our culture. We rarely talk about employee experience and employee engagement at the highest levels of our organization. And we really need to make sure that we have this continuous feedback loop. We need to hear from employees. We need to elevate that to the highest level within the organization. And then we need to make changes. And I think everybody on this call knows this, but sometimes it's amazing to us how many leaders forget this, that culture is made up of more than tangibles like pay and benefits, right? A lot of times we have heard from CEOs, but they're paid really well. I don't know what the problem is. Or they get 3 weeks of vacation each year, they should be happy. But culture is about how we work, right? 3 weeks of vacation when we're back to back on meetings, projects, phone calls without any room to breathe isn't really much of a benefit at the end of the day. Top performing cultures certainly don't happen by accident. And as Katie mentioned when we went into this, it's all about intentionality. Right? You're going to have a culture in your organization, whether you do something about it or not. And the goal really is, how are you going to create an intentional culture? One that really contains not only the secret sauce of what makes your organization special, but also one where each person is bringing something to that table. And think about what elements of your culture make you unique and how can you capitalize on that? When you talk about employee experience, when you talk about the employee value proposition, and how can you make it sticky, right? You want to create a culture where people not only want to stay, but they want to tell their friends about. You want those types of people to really be champions of your culture at the end of the day. And one thing that can get thrown by the wayside is culture is much more than just how you treat your people internally. It's really a reflection of how you treat your external customers and clients and how you're bringing them into that fold too. So just something to keep in mind as we talk about each of these next elements. We're going to spend a little bit of time here on leadership because, as we talked about, one place that we're really seeing pop up is around your role as leader as it relates to culture. And one of the things we can often take for granted is this idea of self-awareness. We may have self-awareness and we may assume that others do as well. And as we start to really think about our leadership teams or leaders and managers throughout our organization, how aware are they of their behaviors? Do their words and actions really align at the end of the day? Are they able to have hard conversations? Right? They often run to the people team, to the HR team to say, I have a problem. Can you fix it for me? Do they lack the skill set? Do they lack the self-awareness? Do they lack the ability to have those hard conversations? All of those things go into creating this type of culture that is open and honest and transparent at the end of the day. And it starts really with holding a mirror up to ourselves to say, how am I showing up? What am I doing? And what is my role in setting culture and setting the stage? And it's always really important to remember people are always watching. Jamie shares this story about it was a pulse survey that was done, an engagement survey. And one of the comments was around how she was not approachable, right? And Jamie, if anybody knows Jamie, I know many on this call do, Jamie's approachable, but she was in a very busy environment. She was on her phone. She wasn't making eye contact. She wasn't saying good morning. And people are making meaning of all of those things. And so how guilty are each of us for doing the same thing, right? When we hop on a Zoom call, do we not say hello? Do we not engage in conversation? Do we wait until, right at 8:30 or 4:30 to click our camera on and our mic on so that we don't have to make small talk? Or do we say hello in the hallways when we're walking by people? Do we say good night at the end of the day? So all of those things, while they may seem small in the grand scheme of things, people are really watching and they're making meaning of all of these small things. So you can imagine how they're assessing those large things that make up culture, right? What was their onboarding experience like? What was their introduction to their leader like? How were they brought into the fold within their teams? We also talk about this idea of going to the balcony. And what that really means is imagine yourself on a balcony looking down as you're interacting with others. This idea of watching yourself on a stage play out. What would your actions and behaviors tell you about your level of self-awareness or how you're showing up? It's kind of taking that 30,000-foot level and getting out of our own way. One thing we talk a lot about is this idea of intent versus impact. We have so many clients and leaders in those organizations who have the best intentions. They really want to do the right thing. They want to create a great experience. They want to be good leaders. And sometimes it just falls apart. Maybe it's through word choices. Maybe it's through not getting in front of employees enough. Maybe it's not having a feedback loop where employees can share suggestions and insights. Sometimes the tiniest thing can have the biggest impact. And then we really go back to this internal lens of asking yourself, are there areas in your organization where you're allowing non-valued aligned behaviors to exist? Right? And if so, why? Is it easier to not have those conversations? Is it something that you just don't want to deal with? So you're almost like an ostrich with your head in the sand. And what are the repercussions of not addressing some of those behaviors? Because all of those things align to create, again, a culture, maybe not intentionally, but there's one that's being created and it's sending a loud and clear message to your employees. And so on this topic of values, we really talk a lot about values in our business. And for us, values are really this foundational element throughout organizations. They're really the building blocks of how we build. And if we have a strong set of values, then anything that comes our way as an organization, we can sustain and we can withstand, because we're using those values to really guide behaviors, actions, and decisions. And so as you think about your organization and as you think about your core values in your organization, how are you using them to guide decisions, right? Are you using them consistently? Is your leadership team using them consistently? How are employees also using to not only guide decisions, but to guide behaviors, to guide their performance? One thing that we've had a lot of luck with is in performance management, tying core values to your ultimate performance management. It may be tied to bonuses, it may be tied to merit increases, but really having the how you are completing your objectives as an important element. Again, it's infusing culture throughout your organization, which is really what we're trying to do here. One mistake that we often see with core values is that they're either loosely or poorly defined. And that can really be this idea of, we have great values, right? We have all these words that we can Google. I'm sure you can find millions upon millions of words that sound great as values: integrity and honesty and courage and innovation and quality and all of these things. But what do they mean? And when they're really loosely defined or not defined at all, employees have no idea what to do with them. And we, as leaders in our organization, can't really hold an employee accountable to something that they don't even know what it means at the end of the day. So one thing we really guide folks to is define those values. Get very clear on what is the action behind a word like courage or behind a word like integrity or innovation. And how does it your employees at all levels in their roles? And so I'd love to hear in the chat some of the values and how you've worked to define them in your organization as well. This is a great opportunity for others to learn from each other on any exercises you've done to help define those values, or how you've engaged employees in defining those values too. One of the things that we've done in the past is a cultural ambassador program. And that's really bringing employees into this discussion of helping define what are values. What do they look like, feel like, smell like, sound like? How do they show up? And having them create those definitions. Jamie, what were you going to say?
Yeah, and they evolve, right? How they continue to show up in your organization is really important. And to the point of like the ambassador program or a culture committee, whatever word you want to use for it, it's an opportunity to involve others in really keeping a pulse on how your culture continues to show up. And why we feel so strongly about core values is Lee called it out about, we define it as behaviors, right? It's the behaviors that are shaping culture. When I started my career with Four Seasons Hotels and Resorts, one of the things that was so great as an early career person is they were guided by the golden rule, which a lot of us have evolved from that, but to treat others as you want to be treated. And when you think about a culture that's delivering really high service, if as an employee, even a frontline employee, whether it's housekeeping or stewarding or front desk, if you knew that you were doing something to create an incredible guest experience, you were going to be supported. What that did is that empowered you at the very front lines to make decisions. And from a culture perspective, it was something you felt. And people who weren't aligned with delivering great service would self-select out because the culture was literally tangible. And so when you think about core values, for me, it's that tangible feeling about how they show up in behaviors. And Hema was talking about leadership, because it's really leadership's job to, if there are actions that are not, or behaviors that are not values aligned, to do something about it. And so it's about identifying these core values, but then, making sure that we enforce them in our organizations when push comes to shove.
Absolutely. And then revisiting, right? You had mentioned this evolution. We're at a time, one thing we have seen is, as a result of this idea of the way that we're working has changed, we're starting to see a lot of organizations coming back to their core values and to their mission and vision, and really saying, is this who we are still? Is this how we want to work? Is this how we want to show up? And so we're finding ourselves spending a lot of time with organizations going through this process of redefining values, of redefining how they want to show up, all to this idea of evolving the employee value proposition and that employee. And this isn't a one and done, right? This, in order to work, has to be pulled through all levels of the organization, and technically starts even before the recruiting process. It starts with our websites. It starts with our career sites. It starts in our job postings. And also just wanted to call out a couple of amazing things that are in our chat too, from Dawn, from Karen, some of the values they've used, how they've organized focus groups to really help with skills and bringing these behaviors to life and what they ultimately mean. And before we move on, there's one really other critical piece on this slide that I wanted to call out, and that's this very last bullet, right? How aligned are you with the values of your organization? Sometimes as people leaders, we don't ask ourselves this question enough. We're so focused on others, right? How are others showing up? How are others contributing or not contributing to what we're trying to create? But how aligned are we with where our organization is going with those behaviors? And we're fortunate in that we sit in a seat where we have a say, that we can bring this up at the end of the day to say, you know, I think it's time that we revisit some of these. How are they showing up for others in our organization? So just something to check in. And again, that's really where that culture self-assessment comes in, of checking back in with yourself and how you're feeling with your company's values.
All right. It is such an exciting time to be doing the work that many of us are doing, because not only are really all organizations facing change, the whole workforce is facing change. And we're going to talk about that. So for me, as someone who loves to be a practitioner in this space, it's really this time of innovation, right? If any of us are using playbooks that we used 10 years ago, it's outdated. And there's no like guidebook on exactly how to do this. And so it's really fun. And this slide is talking about skills, total rewards, and diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And they're all really important. When we think about skills, organizations are really starting to innovate in how they design jobs, how they identify the skills that are needed to succeed today, but into the future. What changes are AI going to have and how the work gets done? And how does that change the skills that are needed? We're seeing organizations work to, skill up internally. Some are making acquisitions just for talent, or looking at is it the build or buy kind of equation. Total talent strategies are now including a lot more elastic talent in companies like ours at Gig Talent to kind of augment those internal teams of full-time resources. And so really getting clear about what are the skills that are needed for your organization is something that is really important. But thinking differently about how we utilize those and how we access them is also something that people are really starting from scratch and being willing to look differently. But what some of the skills that we're seeing across the board that are required are things like adaptability, right? Because we know things are changing. So if you have employees who kind of have a fixed mindset, they're struggling right now, right? Because everyone's going through changes. And, we've been talking about employees and leaders, and we use language like this. And the truth is, leaders are people too, right? So leaders are going through their own change curve as well. So thinking about how we move everybody along on these things, and do they have the right competencies to be effective leaders for what your employees need, or to be employees who can move along with the pace of change in your organization, that your organization needs to be effective. Those are real conversations that we need to have. And so how do we teach agility, adaptability, cultural intelligence, and really help people understand this isn't happening to them, but invite them to be part of this process of change. And so the idea of co-creation and collective experiments, it's something that I'm really enjoying, and it's something that in a way that I really haven't done as much of in the past. A lot of organizations are leveraging strength finders or other things to really help people identify what are their super strengths and what are their super skills that they bring to the organization, and how do we leverage more of that. we're also helping coach people on how to kind of not overplay those strengths, because sometimes strengths have a dark side. And so if they're overplayed, then we can actually not be having the want. So helping people on their development journey, both strategically to align with your business priorities, but also in the areas that people want to develop. We know that one of the key triggers of retention is development. People want to feel like their organizations are investing in them and creating paths for career growth and professional development. And we're seeing some really exciting trends across organizations around infusing professional development as just part of their normal, the way they run their business, rather than special tracks and programs. I can remember throughout my career the benefit of being part of some really incredible leadership development programs. And some of the really large enterprise level organizations do that really well. But when you're talking about smaller and mid-sized organizations, they often don't have the investment in those kinds of programs, but they're finding ways that actually meet people where they're at for some of these most important skills, and bring it alive day to day in how they work and their professional development. So that is also being disrupted in how we think about infusing that development across organizations, not just for select groups. Same with total rewards. So when we think about total rewards, we want to be incentivizing the desired behaviors that we want, right? And oftentimes our systems lag, so that things are changing, employees are changing, the skills that we are now valuing and wanting people to lean into are changing, and yet we might have the same total rewards systems that we've had for 20 years, right? But not looking at it would be a miss, right? So we definitely want to be looking at how are we designing our compensation, benefits, well-being, a lot of support for mental health and financial wellness, development recognition, and do they align? Hema talked a little bit about looking at kind of your brand. I'll just call it your employer brand. It's your internal and external brand. Does it align, right? If you're saying we care about wellness, but your benefits package doesn't make any sense about that, or the way that we care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but our policies don't reflect that. Those kinds of things are causing distrust with employees. And I'll show some data in a little bit that I find really interesting, because going back to the intent versus impact, sometimes as employers, we really mean what we say, but there's this literal assumptions that are coming out of our language that are being misinterpreted and sometimes causing mistrust. So we'll talk about that in a second. Diversity, inclusion, and belonging is not a quota. And we've seen all kinds of trends shifting in this. Obviously, we've been on this ride for a long time, but especially in the last 5 years, where these words mean different things. And what we like to say is that it's not about numbers of people. It's really about, yes, we want to have equal and fair and equitable representation and pay and all of those things, and transparent. There's a lot of really good things that I think have come out of the last few years. But where we're seeing employers really make some significant moves is understanding, like, what does inclusion really look like in your organization? When you have a meeting, do people feel like bring their very best and express and be heard, right? Are we creating an environment that really can extract the best of all of our employees and people feel part of the team? And that starts tying to things like belonging and collaboration and innovation, different work styles, different communication styles, awareness of conflict habits. There's a lot of things where this all ties back to kind of knowing ourselves and knowing others. And so if we have a culture that isn't starting to look at all of these things, and we kind of stay in, maybe some old metrics, kind of looking at data, we might be actually missing the mark of how we really move the needle to make a difference in these areas. So the next one is around engagement and motivation. And again, to me, this is just such an exciting time, because what we know employees want, this came from Harvard Business Review, but the key questions that employees ask of managers is, do you care about me? Can I trust you? And do you have my back? That's what they really want to know. And we know that data shows that most people leave bad managers, right? That's why they leave bad managers. Something that's kind of interesting there, I saw data yesterday that showed that employees who have left their job, changed jobs in the last 2 years, actually have less job satisfaction than people who have stayed in their same job, which is kind of an interesting data point. And you start thinking about they may have left for more pay, or they, whatever reason they left, thinking the grass is greener, but then they come into a new environment, and building a relationship with their new employer and manager and teams can take a while. And it might hit this area around engagement and motivation because they have to rebuild that, and that can take time. When we think about engagement from a leadership perspective, Hema talked about the assumptions that sometimes we make. So, we used to think everyone wants to grow in their career, and that may or may not be true, right? People want to grow, they might want to develop, they want to do well, but not everybody wants to become a leader in your organization. So these assumptions that we may have made, or things that, not even assumptions, just things that we would have really thought to be true in the past, and may have been generally kind of safe to do so. People have really assessed the role that work plays in their life, what they want to prioritize, how they want to grow. And so we just, that idea of co-creation and bringing people along on that journey and having those conversations rather than making assumptions are super important. So when we think about culture and we think about building a strong employee value proposition, we want to make sure that we are building something that people actually want, and getting insight into that by involving people in the conversation is super important. So I'm sure many of you do engagement surveys. It's something that we've used for many, many years, whether you do annual big ones, or now many organizations are using pulse ones. Some companies, every day you have to kind of give a thumbs up or a thumbs down about how you're feeling. I mean, so engagement surveys have taken all kinds of different turns, and there's a lot of value that can be in them. But one of the biggest mistakes I've seen companies make is ask the question and then do nothing about it, right? Ask the question and not actually do anything with the feedback. So one of the big things to think about is, if we're going to ask for people's opinion, what are we going to do with that data, and how are we going to get back to them? And are we willing to actually make the changes? So some of what, we always say as we help organizations kind of scan their cultures is really assessing, like, what are those things? Hema already said it. Where are there behaviors in your organization or things that are disconnected in your organization, and why do they exist? And if you're not willing to do something about it, like, your employees are going to tell you. So if you ask them and they tell you and you still don't do anything about it, that's almost worse than not asking, right? So just be thoughtful about what you ask, but at the same time, they can be really powerful because they really do bring an additional lens that help us gain perspective and break free from assumptions that might have been incorrect. So asking questions, creating focus groups for important conversations within organizations. There's lots of ways to innovate around this, more than beyond kind of a survey, depending on what you're trying to achieve. Listening is absolutely one of the greatest skills for organizations and leaders, and asking open-ended questions. So when we think about how we're developing leaders to be more effective in these areas, teaching coaching skills to leaders is something that is just become almost like a table stake for effective leadership today. Right? Being able to ask these questions without being focused on a specific answer, and really being able to hear from people. It's actually one of the inspiring ways that employees grow and they build their own self-confidence. And as leaders, we get to hear things that we wouldn't hear otherwise. And so when we think about how we create that skill within our organization, teaching coaching skills or having a coaching culture is one of the things that we can really do.
Jamie, real quick, Lee has a great question in the chat.
Yeah.
It says, how important are middle managers as guardians of culture? And do you worry that the desire to deboss organizations, so lay off managers, will further damage engagement?
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, so I think leaders play a critical role. It's not just I think. We know that leaders play an incredible role in culture. And I do think that when you're looking at spans and layers and delayering, and if you don't have a span of control that's effective for managers to really create those connections with employees, that we create those risks. I also think that just because you have leaders doesn't mean that they're creating those relationships and really being effective at creating culture, right? So you can't take either one for granted. The other tension with that is that, leaders, many organizations have working leaders, right? And so they're doing the work. How much are they in the work versus being able to prioritize time leading? And so one of the things that we do with our clients is really help companies think about what does it mean to be a leader in your organization? And are you actually building in your resourcing plan, a percentage of time to leave people to have effective one-on-ones, to create space for development and coaching conversations, and actually institutionalizing that. We know things like feedback, right? And courageous conversations and all those things are things that people need to do. But, if you're in meetings that are all task oriented or project oriented and you don't, it doesn't matter what your title is, if you're not doing that work or creating the space and how you design the work, then you're missing that. So I think it's a yes and it could be anyone, it can be coworkers creating some of that, but I think leaders are the connection. But developing both how we design the work and then giving leaders those skills to be effective in it is what's really important. And I think it's one of the biggest investments companies can make right now is in that it's almost redesigning what leadership means in your organization, getting really clear and supporting leaders, right? Supporting those leaders with the skills and building their confidence and creating systems that support that throughout your employee experience to set them up for success. And I think being transparent with all employees that there's a lot of shifts happening and that we, inviting them on this journey, to me, that's an exciting thing. And it's real. To act like we have it all buttoned up all the time when we don't people can see it, right? And then they just call out the disconnects. And the truth is, even if we could figure out all the disconnects in an organization, we couldn't change them all at one time. We can't, internalize it that quickly. So it's better to kind of just call it out and acknowledge the journey that we're on and invite input and feedback and keep track of it and almost treat it, like you would any other kind of transformation journey.
Yeah, what I would also quickly mention with that is this idea of subcultures, right? So there's this overarching idea of culture at an organizational level, and then diving into what are the subcultures within. So at that kind of boss level that you're talking about, Lee, at that middle manager level, what are some of the departmental subcultures that are created, and how are they either hurting or being positive influences to the broader culture as well? And I think that plays a role in a little bit of this too, in terms of who are the right folks to be leaders and middle managers in the first place. Do they have the people skills to do it versus just the technical skills, which we often see getting promoted, right? You're great at your job, engineer, time to be a people manager. Nobody asked if they were interested in being a people manager. Nobody gave them the foundation or the skill set to be a proper people manager. And now you're affecting the culture and the subculture underneath as a result of these ineffective promotions. And Jamie briefly mentioned this as well, this idea of defining who are leaders in your organization. One of the things I'm really passionate about is this idea that we're all leaders, and at some level, we all need fundamental leadership skills, whether we're leading other people or we're leading projects, right? We're having peer-to-peer communications, things like that. It's leadership qualities and leadership skills for employees throughout our organization at all levels. So when they are ready to get promoted, we're not starting over. We're not determining, oh gosh, they have capabilities, but we're putting them in this role. It's they already have a foundation, and we're here to help them build on that foundation. So I think it's important to think about how are we bringing folks into what we call leadership in our companies.
Absolutely. And so, what we say, is just to ask that last question around how can we take an active effort to build transparency and trust in our organization, looking for where we can build the skills and update the systems and processes to really support what our organizations need now. All right, this next slide, I've been using this slide a lot lately. It was released from Gartner in the last couple months, and you can read the details. But the biggest thing that for me, the reason why I think it's relevant is I think it's important for all of us and our leadership teams to understand that we are not in a vacuum, right? Everyone's going through change. So whatever your culture is going through, whatever tension points, whatever, if you guys are talking about, I mean, return to work and flexibility and how we work and we need more productivity, or, whatever the discussion is in your organization and how it's showing up, there's some comfort in kind of understanding that changes are happening at a macro level as well. So throughout the workforce. So you can see here, though, on the left, what organizations believe, and on the right-hand side, what we're hearing from employees. And so these areas of tension are likely showing up really in all organizations, even if they show up in different ways. And I think it's really important to help leaders kind of understand that and start to understand that, like this one about, we're going to demand everyone in the office, but we're only going to enforce it like 25% of the time, or our leaders are going to be inconsistent in how we enforce it. And we're going to tell people, you can't get promoted and have a strong career if you work fully remote. But then we've been promoting people over the last companies are fully remote and people progress and have amazing careers. So we're saying certain things like language and then not doing it. And people are like, that's BS. They're quite frankly calling us out. And it undermines trust and confidence in leadership and in our organizational culture. The same thing around productivity, right? So organizations are extremely concerned about productivity, and I'll hear things like, well, some people are just walking their dog all the time, right? We don't know if people are actually doing the work, and how do we know if they're working on the most important things? And then you have other employees who are talking about burnout, right? And they feel like they can't sustain the current level of performance over the next year. And those could all be true, right? Some of it is about leadership. Like, how are you should know what your employees are working on and if they need help, and and you should know how to manage the work, right? It's not about button seat and what many hours did you spend in the office. It's also probably true that we're relying on our really high performers, the people that we, kick stuff over to, they get it done, they take more and more. And there's some people that are probably kind of below the line that we might not actively be managing that performance. And so that inconsistency, you can't have a blatant statement that when people look around and know that it's untrue. And who does it reflect on? It reflects on leadership, and it impacts our overall culture, and it can demotivate our high performers, and quite frankly, even risk losing them. And the bottom one here about trust, all of this starts to go to trust, right? There's mistrust on both sides. And how do we start to build that? We work together, we listen, we ask questions, we be honest. And I think we really need a lot of our, the way that it's kind of neat, because we wrote this book, actually, we finished it early in COVID. The roadmap you can still use today. You're just going to use it with the new lens of whatever's showing up in your organization to look through these key pillars and then get honest. And that will allow for alignment to improve a lot of these areas. So I just thought that was important to kind of help people understand it's not just acute, whatever you're facing in your company, but it's happening globally, and people are feeling these things. All right, so let's talk about how do we move to action. Our goal with this was really, we could probably talk about it all day long. You can hear we love this stuff, and we're a little bit of geeks when it comes to culture and leadership, and we feel really strongly about it. But it's not about the book, and it's not about a list of things to do. It's really, how do you bring it alive? And so we think that a lot of these things are kind of about going back to basics, right? The fundamentals of culture. And thinking, like, are we doing what we say we're going to do? Are the things that are important to us what we do? And are we willing to stick by what we're saying? And helping your organization methodically look through and assess that in a really honest way. Because most people believe what they're saying, but if it's not what you're doing, then we need to reassess, right? And so how do we stick? And so how do we help leaders really believe in those changes you're making? And I think that idea of bringing really everyone in your organization along on these changes today is critical. And it can't be something that's being done to people. We want to bring people along. And so, we've talked about change management kind of indirectly through all of this. when we think about, change, the why, the what, the urgency, helping people understand things are changing, even if they're not really aware that things are changing, like that macro level, and inviting them to participate in that conversation. Whether you do a full-on transformation project or you do it could be at a department level, or you could start with your leadership team. But however you approach that, really being intentional about change management and tying communications and any other process improvement or changes that you're making in your organization to the overall intentional direction that you're trying to go with culture is really important to get ahead of that. Lee's saying change is fundamentally broken because it's focused on process, not people. Yeah, absolutely. And again, the people, I think, are wanting different things. And so involving them to hear that so that we can incorporate those lenses into the changes that we make are really, really important. Let's see. And we know this doesn't happen fast, right? A lot of people, when we come in and we'll do a culture assessment and help create a roadmap, that is absolutely just the beginning. If you guys are practitioners in this space, you know that change takes a lot of time. And quite frankly, there's not an end point. It's an evolution, but it's how do we get to alignment within our organizations that we want to do. So on the next slide, just a moment of reflection. We've done a lot of talking and we're going to open it up to conversation here in a minute. But hopefully there's been a couple nuggets or something that's struck you that you might want to take to your organization or clients that you work with. And I just want to give you a minute here to write down those things. And if you have been, I think that we might have to send out the attachment separately. I don't think we were able to upload it in the chat, but if we do that, that'll be some questions that you can also take to kind of take some of this and put it into action.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll be sending out the slides from today, also the PDF that was mentioned earlier. So we'll make sure that all goes out as well. Just while people are sort of thinking about this question on the screen, I'm very aware we've only got a couple of minutes left of everyone's time. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Jamie, to Hema, to Catherine. It's been a really great conversation, and I know we haven't had a chance to kind of open it up to chat and questions, but the chat within this call has been really active, lots of great conversation. As Hema said at the beginning, feel free to swap LinkedIn details on here or come and join us on the EX space. If you're not already a member, come and join us. You can join as part of a practitioner or pro community, or we're still offering our essentials subscription levels for free at the moment. So I will put a link in the chat. So come and check us out. It's a great way to kind of meet with like-minded people working on all of these great things. And of course, we will upload this webinar to the EX space as well. A huge thank you to you all. Any kind of parting words or anything that you'd like to say?
No, thank you for having us today. We really appreciate it. I loved everything in the chat as well. Some really good, information sharing that was happening. I love it. And I just think keep doing the amazing work, because it's folks on this call who are really going to be the champions of how we continue to think about culture and leadership and what that looks like in our organizations. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Such a pleasure. Have a fantastic day.
Or evening for many of you.
Or evening, yes. And awards, Lee, and awards.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Cheers.